The house that wouldn't stay silent the night was calm, almost unnaturally so, when Nadia and her younger brother Saad moved into their grandmother's old house on the outskirts of town. Their grandmother had passed away just a month earlier, and their father insisted they stay there temporarily while renovations were being completed on their own home. The house was large, too large for just two young siblings, with long corridors, creaking staircases, and windows that stared into the woods beyond. On the first evening, Nadia stood by her bedroom window and noticed how the tree leaves shifted oddly in the breeze, though the air outside was perfectly still. She told herself it was just nerves. That night, Saad complained about noises in the walls. He described it as whispers, like when people tell secrets at school. Nadia scolded him for being dramatic, but she couldn't deny that the silence in the house seemed heavier than usual, like a blanket pressed against her chest. The electricity flickered once, dimming the hallway light, and for a brief second, she thought she saw something dark moving at the end of the corridor. When she blinked, it was gone. She shook her head, reminding herself that her grandmother's house was just old. Pipes rattled, floors groaned, lights misbehaved. There was nothing unusual about it. On the second night, Nadia awoke to the distinct sound of footsteps moving slowly across the upstairs landing. She lay in bed frozen, listening, her breath caught in her throat. The steps paused directly outside her door. She wanted to convince herself it was Saad sneaking around, but she could hear him faintly snoring in the room next to hers. Her hand hovered over the doorknob, trembling, but she didn't open it. She just listened. After a moment of unbearable stillness, the footsteps retreated down the hallway toward the staircase, each creak echoing louder than the last. Nadia pulled the blanket over her head and stayed awake until dawn. By the third day, she began to notice changes in the house itself. Doors that were left open would be found shut, chairs slightly pulled back from tables, and objects out of place. At first, she accused Saad of messing around, but his pale face and trembling denial convinced her otherwise. He admitted that every night, without fail, the whispers returned, clearer each time. "It's like they're talking about us," he whispered to her, clutching her arm. Nadia brushed it off, but inside her stomach twisted. She couldn't shake the feeling that the house wasn't empty when the two of them were alone. It was watching, waiting, feeding on their presence. On the fourth night, the whispers finally reached Nadia's ears. She had been drifting into uneasy sleep when she heard them, a chorus of hushed voices slipping through the walls. They weren't distinct words, not at first, but more like breaths dragging against her skin. Slowly, they grew louder, sharper, as though dozens of people were standing just outside her door, murmuring her name. "Nadia." The sound crawled into her mind and shook her awake. She bolted upright, drenched in sweat. The house was supposed to be silent, but instead, it hummed with unseen life. That was the first night she realized her grandmother's house wasn't just haunted, it was alive. The whispers in the walls. Nadia woke with a start the following morning, her body aching from hours of tense, sleepless tossing. Sunlight streamed through the curtains, but it did nothing to wash away the lingering sense of dread that clung to her. Saad sat on the edge of her bed, his eyes wide and hollow. "You heard it too, didn't you?" he whispered. She wanted to lie, to protect him, but the memory of her name being whispered from the walls burned too strongly in her mind. Instead, She only nodded. For a moment, neither of them spoke. They sat in silence, the weight of an unseen presence pressing against them both. That afternoon, Nadia decided to distract them with chores. The kitchen, however, felt wrong. Dust clung stubbornly to the shelves, and the smell of damp would lingered in the air. As she scrubbed the counters, her hand brushed against something beneath the cupboard lining. Pulling it free, she discovered a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age. Unfolding it revealed shaky handwriting. Don't listen when it calls your name. Don't answer the door after midnight. Don't stay in the dark. Nadia's breath caught. The note looked old, decades old, and was signed only with the initials AS. She shoved it into her pocket, unwilling to show Saad. That night, the house was less forgiving. As the siblings prepared for bed, Nadia double-checked every lock and light switch. Yet when she returned upstairs, she found Saad's door ajar, even though she was sure she had closed it. He stood inside, staring at the corner of his room, frozen. His small lamp illuminated the walls, but the shadows in the corner writhed unnaturally, shifting as though something unseen was moving within them. "It's talking to me," he whispered, his voice trembling. Nadia grabbed him by the shoulders and yanked him back, shutting the door with a slam. But the whispers did not stop. They followed them, trailing from the corners of the house. Sometime after midnight, Nadia awoke again. This time, there was no doubt about what she heard. A series of knocks echoed through the house, 3 slow, deliberate raps against the front door. Her entire body froze as the sound reverberated through the walls. Saad ran into her room, eyes wide with terror, whispering frantically, "Don't answer it. Don't answer it." She clutched him to her chest, remembering the note from the kitchen. Whoever, or whatever, was outside didn't knock like a neighbor. It knocked like it knew them, like it had been waiting. When the knocking finally ceased, the house exhaled, settling back into its eerie stillness. But Nadia couldn't shake the feeling that something had been invited in simply by their fear. By dawn, the siblings barely spoke. Exhaustion etched itself into Nadia's face as she stared out the window toward the woods. The trees seemed to lean closer, their shadows stretching longer toward the house. Saad, pale and withdrawn, muttered quietly to himself, as though holding a conversation with someone she couldn't hear. When she asked, he only replied, "They want us to listen." That morning, Nadia realized 2 things. The house wasn't just alive, it was hungry. And if they stayed much longer, it wouldn't just whisper their names. It would take them. The thing in the hallway the third night after the knocking was the worst yet. Nadia tried to keep Saad in her room so he wouldn't be alone, but the boy refused to sleep. He sat upright on her bed, eyes glued to the darkened hallway outside her door, as though waiting for something to emerge. "It's there," he whispered hoarsely, clutching a pillow against his chest. "It keeps standing in the hall." Nadia tried to reassure him, but her own nerves betrayed her. She could feel it too. The house seemed to breathe heavier at night, each creak and sigh of the wood echoing like a heartbeat. Around 2 in the morning, Saad shook her awake, his small hand trembling violently against her arm. "Look," he hissed, pointing to the half-open door. At first, she saw nothing but shadow. But then it appeared, tall, impossibly thin, its outline flickering as if it were stitched together from the darkness itself. Its head tilted unnaturally to one side, watching them. Nadia's breath caught. her chest locking in terror. She shut her eyes tightly, praying it was a trick of her imagination. When she opened them again, the figure was gone, but the whispers were louder, filling the room like a chorus just beyond the walls. Desperate to distract herself, Nadia pulled the old note from her pocket and read it under the weak glow of her bedside lamp. Don't listen when it calls your name. Don't answer the door after midnight. Don't stay in the dark. Her stomach nodded. Every warning was already happening. Saad's lips quivered as he whispered, "It already knows our names." His words hung in the air, heavier than the silence that followed. Nadia realized then that the note wasn't a warning for strangers. It was a record of survival, or maybe a failed attempt at it. Someone before them had fought the same thing. The night stretched on endlessly. At one point, Nadia thought she heard soft scratching at her bedroom walls, like fingernails dragging slowly across plaster. She pressed her ear against the wallpaper, and the sound stopped, only to resume directly behind her, on the opposite wall. Saad buried himself under the blankets, muffling his sobs. Nadia wanted to run, to leave the house entirely, but she couldn't bring herself to step into that hallway where the figure had been. The darkness outside her door was no longer just absence of light. It was occupied by morning. Their fragile grip on normalcy had shattered. Saad barely touched his breakfast, staring blankly at the window. It stood closer last night, he muttered. Nadia pretended not to hear, but her own hands trembled as she poured water into a glass. She couldn't shake the image of that shadowy figure lingering at her door, watching. And though daylight had returned, the feeling remained. This was no longer just a haunted house. This was a trap, and they had already stepped too far inside to escape easily. The journal and the floorboards, Nadia knew they couldn't go on like this. Every night brought something darker, something closer, and the whispers were burrowing into her head like worms. She decided to search the house during the day, reasoning that sunlight might protect her courage. While Saad sat silently at the kitchen table, tracing patterns in the dust with his finger, Nadia climbed the creaky stairs and began rifling through every drawer, every closet. She was desperate for answers, for some hint as to why her grandmother's house was anything but ordinary. In the upstairs study, she noticed one of the floorboards was loose. Kneeling, she pried it up with a screwdriver and found a small leather-bound journal hidden beneath. The cover was cracked with age, and the pages inside smelled of mildew. The handwriting matched the note she had found in the kitchen, signed with the same initials. Yes, flipping through the entries, her heart pounded. Each page described strange happenings, voices in the walls, footsteps in the hall, and warnings of a figure that came at night. The final pages grew frantic, the script slanting and jagged. It wants the children. It feeds on their names. If you hear it, it's already too late. She slammed the book shut, trembling. Yes, whoever they were, had lived through the same horrors, but something told Nadia they hadn't survived. She carried the journal downstairs, her palms slick with sweat. Saad looked up from the table as she placed it in front of him. "It's been here before," she whispered. This thing doesn't stop." His lips trembled as he asked the question she had been avoiding. Did Grandma know? For a moment, Nadia couldn't answer. But deep down, she felt the truth pressing heavily on her chest. Their grandmother had known. That night, the entity grew bolder. The whispers were no longer confined to the walls. They came from the rooms themselves. As Nadia tucked Saad into bed, she heard her own name spoken directly into her ear, cold breath grazing her skin. She spun around, but no one was there. Saad clutched her hand, his wide eyes fixed on the door. "It's coming," he whispered. And then, as if to prove him right, the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps creaked up the stairs. The door handle rattled. Nadia shoved the dresser against it, her heart hammering, but the handle twisted harder, as though unseen hands were determined to force their way inside. The assault lasted for what felt like hours, pounding, scratching, the sound of heavy weight pressing against the door. Then silence. Nadia sat with her back against the dresser, clutching Saad close. When she finally dared to open the journal again, she found a passage she hadn't noticed before. "If you stay too long, the house remembers you. It keeps what it calls." Tears burned her eyes as realization struck. They weren't just trapped inside the house. The house was making sure they never left. The family's secret the morning after the attack on the bedroom door, Nadia could no longer ignore the suspicion that had been gnawing at her. If the journal was hidden in the floorboards, if the note was tucked away in the kitchen, then her grandmother must have known this evil had lingered in the house for years. But why had she never spoken of it? Why had she let Nadia and Saad step into its grasp? Determined, Nadia scoured the house for more answers, pulling boxes from closets, searching through trunks and drawers, until she discovered a stack of letters in her grandmother's wardrobe. The top one, folded and brittle, was addressed to Amara Siddiqui. Her hands trembled as she opened it. The handwriting was the same as the journal's. Yes, was Amara Siddiqui, her grandmother. The letters chronicled her youth, written to someone named M. In them, Amara described her terror growing up in the same house. The whispers, the figure in the hallway, the rules she had to follow to survive. She admitted she had tried to escape many times, but the house followed her, as though it clung to her bloodline. The final letter was the worst of all. "The house does not forgive. It waits for the children. It will take them if I am gone." Nadia's blood ran cold. The realization hit her like a blow. Her grandmother hadn't just known. The house had claimed her as a child and kept her captive for the rest of her life. Now, with her gone, it was reaching for Nadia and Saad. The inheritance wasn't a gift. It was a curse, passed down like a legacy of doom. When she told Saad, his face went pale. "So it's our turn?" he asked quietly. Nadia could barely bring herself to nod. That night, the entity came closer than ever. As soon as the sun slipped beneath the trees, the house shifted. The air turned heavy, the lights flickered, and the sound of whispers swelled to deafening levels. Shadows bled across the walls, stretching toward them. From the corner of her eye, Nadia saw movement in the living room mirror, her grandmother's reflection staring back at her, mouth moving in silent words. She grabbed Saad's hand and bolted up the stairs, but the footsteps followed, loud, heavy, not human anymore. The house itself seemed to be chasing them. Back in her room, Nadia shoved the dresser against the door again, her chest heaving. Saad sat trembling on the bed, muttering prayers under his breath. She opened the journal one last time, scanning the frantic scrawls for guidance. At the bottom of one page was a single line underlined twice. "The house only wants what it knows. Blood answers blood." Nadia's stomach dropped. The entity wasn't just haunting them. It was bound to them. They weren't intruders in this nightmare. They were the offering. The failed escape Nadia couldn't sit and wait for the house to consume them. The letters, the journal, the whispers, they all pointed to one truth. If she and Saad stayed, they would never leave alive. That evening, she packed what little they had into a bag and told Saad they were leaving as soon as it was dark enough to run without being seen. His wide eyes filled with both hope and fear. "Do you think it'll let us?" he asked quietly. Nadia didn't answer. She just gripped his hand tighter, trying to convince herself it was possible. When night fell, they crept down the staircase. The air was unbearably heavy, as if the house knew what they were planning. Every step groaned beneath their weight, each creak echoing louder than the last. Nadia reached the front door, her heart pounding so violently she thought it might burst. She twisted the lock, pulled the handle, and froze. The door didn't budge. It wasn't just locked. It felt fused to the frame, as though the wood itself had grown around it. Behind them, a whisper hissed, "Don't go." Panic surged through her veins. She pulled harder, yanking with all her strength, but the door wouldn't move. Saad screamed suddenly, pointing down the hallway. The tall, flickering figure was there again, closer this time, its elongated form swaying unnaturally as it began moving toward them. Its steps didn't sound like feet hitting the floor. It sounded like bones dragging across wood. Nadia grabbed Saad's hand and bolted to the back door, but it too was sealed, its handle ice cold under her palm. The kitchen windows rattled as though invisible hands pounded against the glass from outside. With nowhere else to go, Nadia dragged Saad upstairs, hoping to find a way out through a window. But the house warped as they climbed. The hallway stretched unnaturally long, doors multiplying where there hadn't been any before. The wallpaper seemed to peel in strips as they ran, exposing endless blackness beneath. The whispers were deafening now, dozens of voices overlapping, all chanting their names in a chilling harmony. Nadia, Saad. It was as if the house was mocking them, savoring their terror. Finally, they stumbled into Nadia's room and slammed the door. She shoved the dresser back against it just as the handle began to turn. Saad collapsed on the bed, sobbing, while Nadia's chest heaved with desperation. The journal still sat on the nightstand, open to a page she hadn't noticed before. Her grandmother's frantic handwriting scrawled across it read, "You cannot run. The house is not a place. It is a hunger, and it will only end when it is fed." Nadia's hands shook as the words burned into her mind. Escape was impossible. The house didn't want them gone. It wanted them inside, forever. When the walls breathed, the dresser shuddered against the bedroom door as unseen weight pressed from the other side. Each slam rattled the floorboards, sending dust drifting from the ceiling. Saad sobbed into his pillow, whispering prayers so fast they blurred together. Nadia clutched the journal, her eyes scanning every frantic line, searching for something, anything, that might tell her how to stop this nightmare. The words leapt out at her. "The walls are its lungs. When the house breathes, you are already inside it." Her stomach lurched. It wasn't just their prison. They were part of it now. The air grew unbearably thick, like they were trapped in a furnace. The walls around them swelled and contracted, groaning with each unnatural breath. Plaster cracked, sending fine white dust into the air. The wallpaper bulged outward as if something were pushing from the inside. straining to get through. A long fissure tore across the ceiling, and through it came a sound, a low, guttural moan that reverberated through their bones. Nadia covered Saad's ears, but she couldn't protect him from the feeling of it crawling under their skin. Then the whispers stopped. Silence crashed over them, heavier than the noise had ever been. The door handle ceased rattling, the banging ceased, and for one terrifying moment Nadia thought it might all be over. She dared to move closer to the dresser, pressing her ear to the wood. Nothing. No breath. No whispers. But then came the slow scrape of something enormous moving inside the walls, circling the room like a predator stalking its prey. Saad's wide eyes followed the sound as the plaster bulged inward, forming the faint outline of a hand, then a face pressing through, features stretched and distorted. With a choked cry, Nadia grabbed the journal and flipped frantically through the last pages. The final entry wasn't a warning, it was a ritual. Written in her grandmother's desperate scrawl, it detailed a way to confront the entity. Blood binds it. The blood of the house is the key. Cut it, mark it, command it. Nadia's hands shook violently. She didn't understand what it meant, but it was the only hope they had. She tore the page free, clutching it like a lifeline as the wall cracked open, plaster splintering outward. A long, skeletal arm pushed through the wall, black and glistening like tar. Its claws scraped against the dresser, pulling it aside with ease. The door groaned as if bowing to its master, and then, slowly, deliberately, it began to swing open. The thing in the hallway no longer hid in shadow. It was here, inside, and it was coming for them. The ritual, the thing entered the room in fragments, as though reality itself could barely contain it. First came its hands, elongated and jagged, then its torso, twisting unnaturally as it forced itself through the doorframe. The air stank of damp rot and burned iron, each breath from the house rattling the furniture. Nadia felt her body lock with terror, but the journal page in her hand pulsed like a command, her grandmother's frantic words etched into her mind. Blood binds it. Cut it, mark it, command it. It wasn't just instructions. It was an order left for her to finish. With trembling resolve, she grabbed a shard of broken glass from the dresser's cracked mirror. Saad whimpered as she sliced her palm open, the sting sharp, blood welling immediately. She pressed her hand against the warped wooden floorboards. The moment her blood touched the wood, the house reacted. Walls shuddered, whispers rose in a deafening scream, and the figure staggered as though in pain. Nadia used the blood to trace the symbols written in the journal, her fingers shaking as she scrawled crude shapes into the floor. The entity shrieked, not a sound of voice, but of the entire house groaning in agony. Its form convulsed, flickering between shadow and flesh, its limbs snapping into unnatural angles. Keep going, Saad cried, clutching her arm as she struggled to draw the final mark. Her blood smeared across the floor in frantic strokes, the wood absorbing it like thirsty soil. The whispers twisted into words, each one layered over the other, voices hissing. Yours, yours, yours. The house wasn't trying to stop her anymore. It was demanding her submission. Nadia screamed as she slammed her bloody palm onto the last symbol. For a moment, everything stopped. The walls froze. The figure collapsed into a smear of black smoke, and silence filled the house. Saad looked at her with wide, trembling eyes. Did you kill it? He asked. Nadia wanted to believe she had. She wanted to think her grandmother's ritual had worked. But deep in her chest, she felt the truth vibrating in her bones. She hadn't destroyed it. She had awakened it. The silence shattered. The symbols on the floor ignited with a crimson glow, pulsing like veins. The entire house groaned and bent inward, floorboards buckling as though the structure itself was alive and writhing. The figure began to reform from the smoke, taller, darker, its presence filling every corner. The ritual hadn't banished it, it had given it flesh. And now, it was stronger than ever. The keeper's choice, the room shook violently as the entity rose from the smoke, its body no longer fragile shadow, but solid, monstrous flesh. Its skin dripped like tar, its eyes hollow caverns burning with a sickly red glow. The glowing symbols on the floor pulsed in rhythm with its movements, as though tethering it to Nadia's blood. Saad screamed and pulled her back, but the creature didn't strike. Instead, it leaned forward, its voice a guttural blend of 100 whispers, and hissed, "You called me. You bind me. You are mine." Nadia's breath caught in her throat. The ritual hadn't freed them. It had tied her to it. Every word in the journal clicked into place. Blood answers blood. The house hadn't been feeding on her grandmother. It had been keeping her as its anchor, its keeper. And now, with Amara gone, it had chosen Nadia. She felt the symbols burning against her skin, her blood humming with the same unnatural rhythm. She wasn't fighting the house anymore. She was becoming part of it. Saad shook her, desperate. "We have to run. We have to get out now." But when Nadia tried to stand, the house rebelled. The floor shifted beneath her feet, forcing her back onto her knees. Her blood pooled across the symbols, and she realized she wasn't just trapped, she was rooted. The house was feeding through her wound, claiming her inch by inch. The entity loomed closer, but instead of striking, it extended a long, blackened claw, touching her forehead with surprising gentleness. 1,000 voices filled her head, whispering in unison, "Stay. Keep. Continue." For a split second, Nadia saw flashes, memories that weren't hers. Her grandmother as a child, huddled in the same bedroom, performing the same ritual. Years of her life locked in this house, whispers weaving through her days, keeping her bound until she grew old. Nadia felt the crushing weight of inevitability. This wasn't a haunting. It was inheritance. Every generation, the house chose one of them to serve, to feed, to remain. And now it had chosen her. Tears streamed down her face as Saad begged her to fight it. His small hands gripped hers tightly, refusing to let go. She looked into his terrified eyes and realized she still had one choice left. The house could take her, but it didn't have to take him. Her grandmother's scrawled warning echoed in her mind. The house only wants what it knows. Nadia squeezed Saad's hands one last time and whispered, "When I tell you run, don't look back." The house that wouldn't stay silent the night was calm, almost unnaturally so, when Nadia and her younger brother Saad moved into their grandmother's old house on the outskirts of town. Their grandmother had passed away just a month earlier, and their father insisted they stay there temporarily while renovations were being completed on their own home. The house was large, too large for just two young siblings, with long corridors, creaking staircases, and windows that stared into the woods beyond. On the first evening, Nadia stood by her bedroom window and noticed how the tree leaves shifted oddly in the breeze, though the air outside was perfectly still. She told herself it was just nerves. That night, Saad complained about noises in the walls. He described it as whispers, like when people tell secrets at school. Nadia scolded him for being dramatic, but she couldn't deny that the silence in the house seemed heavier than usual, like a blanket pressed against her chest. The electricity flickered once, dimming the hallway light, and for a brief second, she thought she saw something dark moving at the end of the corridor. When she blinked, it was gone. She shook her head, reminding herself that her grandmother's house was just old. Pipes rattled, floors groaned, lights misbehaved. There was nothing unusual about it. On the second night, Nadia awoke to the distinct sound of footsteps moving slowly across the upstairs landing. She lay in bed frozen, listening, her breath caught in her throat. The steps paused directly outside her door. She wanted to convince herself it was Saad sneaking around, but she could hear him faintly snoring in the room next to hers. Her hand hovered over the doorknob, trembling, but she didn't open it. She just listened. After a moment of unbearable stillness, the footsteps retreated down the hallway toward the staircase, each creak echoing louder than the last. Nadia pulled the blanket over her head and stayed awake until dawn. By the third day, she began to notice changes in the house itself. Doors that were left open would be found shut, chairs slightly pulled back from tables, and objects out of place. At first, she accused Saad of messing around, but his pale face and trembling denial convinced her otherwise. He admitted that every night, without fail, the whispers returned, clearer each time. "It's like they're talking about us," he whispered to her, clutching her arm. Nadia brushed it off, but inside her stomach twisted. She couldn't shake the feeling that the house wasn't empty when the two of them were alone. It was watching, waiting, feeding on their presence. On the fourth night, the whispers finally reached Nadia's ears. She had been drifting into uneasy sleep when she heard them, a chorus of hushed voices slipping through the walls. They weren't distinct words, not at first, but more like breaths dragging against her skin. Slowly, they grew louder, sharper, as though dozens of people were standing just outside her door, murmuring her name. "Nadia." The sound crawled into her mind and shook her awake. She bolted upright, drenched in sweat. The house was supposed to be silent, but instead, it hummed with unseen life. That was the first night she realized her grandmother's house wasn't just haunted, it was alive.